Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of class. We are moving on at a steady clip throughout U.S. history, although we are still technically in the period known as the colonial era. Roughly speaking, you could argue that that ends around 1776 with the issuing of the Declaration of Independence. You might say that the colonial era ends in 1763 with the French and Indian War coming to a conclusion, and ultimately you move into what you might want to call kind of the move towards revolution. And that's right sort of where we're going to be at this week. And we're going to be talking about a number of different topics and events that happened during this period from roughly before 1763 right up until 1763 with the finishing of the French and Indian War. Okay. Now, one of the things that I think is really important as we begin to think about the coming of the American Revolution and this move towards independence and turning these 13 colonies into 13 states is that there's far more to it than just the issuing of taxes by the British Parliament and by King George III. In fact, really to understand why the colonials responded to these forms of taxation the way that they did, we need to place them into a much broader and larger context. And so to do that, we're going to try and look at some of the ideological and philosophical foundations of thought that were put into place before the taxes were ever levied against the colonials. Again, that process really gets going after 1763. That stated, there were definitely attempts by the British to try and control the colonies with respects to commerce and mercantilism and the way in which monies and goods flowed prior to 1763. But frequently those efforts were not always consistent, but we'll be talking more about all that. But essentially what we're going to be doing this week, and we're going to be looking at this somewhat cursorily, I say that because many of the topics that we're going to bring up this week are very in-depth, detailed topics that you could really spend an entire 18 weeks just looking at. But two of the things that we're going to be looking at this week with respects to the way in which the colonials came to think about society and government law and even religion is we're going to be taking a look at the development of the Enlightenment and specifically we are going to be looking at just a handful of theories set forth by a gentleman by the name of John Locke, who was a medical doctor out of England, who was writing right at the end of the English Civil Wars, and he was in many ways responding to that, talking about the relationship between subjects and their government. And what that relationship should look like. And so we're going to be looking at just a handful, just some of the philosophies of John Locke in terms of its connection to what would become the United States. And then we're also going to be looking at the First Great Awakening, which was a religious revival movement that swept through the colonies. And what's interesting about both of these is that in many ways they come from two very different kind of viewpoints, one more secular and one far more religious. But what they do is they actually both contribute to the colonials thinking about themselves in kind of independent sort of ways. Like they are sovereign. They're not English colonials, although they technically are English colonials, but many of them have begun to think of themselves as Americans. And both of these movements really shape that type of mindset. And we'll get more into that during the lecture. But again, we're just skipping the stone just across the surface of both of these topics. We will also be taking a look at the French and Indian War, a conflict that's also known as the 7 Years' War. It was kind of a global conflict that affected not just the colonials, although the situation sort of originated there, and ultimately it spills over into a kind of a global context in Europe. But we'll be looking at that, and that's a significant conflict because it really taxed the British with respects to draining their treasury. And as far as the leadership in Britain was concerned, they in some ways really much felt that the colonials should pay for some of this war debt. So that's where the taxes sort of become from. So with all that stated, we're going to be looking at all of these things to try and paint a very broad and large picture about why and how we went from 13 separate English colonies until ultimately declaring our independence in 1776. And one thing that I will say is that the war for independence, the American Revolution as it was actually began before we declared our independence. It actually begins in 1775, and we don't declare our independence until 1776. Okay, but that's just a bit of free information there for you for this week. We'll be talking more about that in the coming weeks. So, all right, with that, that's pretty much what I got for you this week. That's what we're going to be looking at. As always, do your part to get your main posts to the discussion boards up by Thursday at 11:59, and then of course subsequent responses to students by Sunday at 11:59. Otherwise, as I will leave you, go in peace, be warm and filled, may the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.